Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Do you ever feel stuck when you're trying to speak English? Maybe your pronunciation doesn't sound quite right, or you feel slow and hesitant. You've studied grammar and vocabulary, but putting it all together smoothly still feels like a challenge. What if I told you there's a simple, powerful technique that can help you sound more natural, boost your confidence, and dramatically improve your speaking and listening skills? It's called shadowing. Let's dive into it with our host for more details.
Okay, let's unpack this. You know that feeling, right? Just this constant stream of information, articles piling up. You want to be really well informed, but it feels like, well, like you just can't keep up.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That feeling of overload is it's very real. And it's not just about getting the information in, it's about making it stick,
Yeah.
processing it properly.
Exactly. And sometimes the best ways to do that, the best techniques, they come from, well, kind of surprising places.
They really do.
And that's what we're focusing on in this deep dive. We've been digging through a bunch of stuff, research papers, articles on learning, practical guides, and some really fascinating insights actually come from language learning research.
Right. And we've pulled out two core techniques that on the surface seem pretty simple: shadowing and repetition.
Simple but powerful.
That's the idea. So our mission here is to really unpack these two. What are they? How do they actually work? Like biologically or cognitively? What does the research really say about how well they work? And interestingly, where else do these ideas show up?
The goal being to give you, our listeners, some solid takeaways. How can understanding these help you learn faster, more deeply, whatever it is you're trying to master?
Exactly. So first things first, definitions. Shadowing. What exactly are we talking about?
Okay, shadowing.
Think of it like being an echo, basically. You listen to someone speaking, often a native speaker, if it's language learning, and you repeat what they say immediately, like right after them, trying to mimic their rhythm, their intonation, everything.
So you're their shadow, verbally speaking.
Pretty much. It's sometimes even called somber repetition, which literally means shadowing repetition. You're trying to stay right on their heels.
Okay, got it. Echoing in real time.
Yeah.
And then repetition. Most people probably think they get this one. Just saying stuff over and over.
Well, yeah, that's the core idea, intentionally saying words or phrases multiple times. But the key thing to note here is how they relate. Shadowing always involves repetition, right? You are repeating. But it adds that crucial piece, the real-time listening and the immediate mimicking. That's different from just, say, reciting a list you memorized.
Okay, so we know what they are. Shadowing is echoing, repetition is repeating. But the big question, the why. Why does this actually help us learn? How does it work? Inside our heads, our bodies. What's the science?
This is where it gets really cool, and it goes surprisingly deep. Shadowing, particularly, has roots way back in psychoacoustics research. Decades ago, researchers were trying to measure the tiny, tiny time difference between when someone speaks and when they perceive speech, even their own speech.
Wow, okay. How do they even measure that?
With some pretty clever methods, actually, like putting an artificial palate in someone's mouth to track tongue movements and reaction times down to milliseconds.
An artificial palate.
Yeah.
Seriously, that sounds invasive.
A bit, yeah. But it led to some fundamental insights. For example, they found reaction times were consistently shorter for consonants compared to vowels, and how a vowel was processed depended on the consonant right before it.
What did that suggest?
It supported the idea that the phone, the smallest distinct sound unit, like P in PAT, is like a basic building block for the brain. The brain seems to process speech using these small units first, maybe not whole syllables initially.
So it breaks it down into tiny sound pieces.
Seems like it. And biologically, our hearing system is just incredibly well suited for this. Think about the basilar membrane in your inner ear.
Okay, the frequency analyzer.
Right. Exactly. Different parts vibrate for different frequencies. And what's interesting is, research suggests that holding a tone for even a short time, maybe 100 milliseconds or so, that seems to sharpen the activity of the auditory nerve fibers connected to that specific frequency region.
And 100 milliseconds. That sounds like about the length of a speech sound.
Precisely. It aligns really well with the pace of normal speech sounds. It suggests that listening to moderately paced phrases, like you do in shadowing, gives your auditory system just the right amount of time to process and distinguish those sounds clearly. Makes it easier for the brain to then recognize and reproduce them.
Huh. So the timing in shadowing isn't just arbitrary, it's kind of tuned to our biology. That's neat.
It is. And then there's the motor connection, the physical act of speaking.
Right.
There's this thing called the motor theory of speech perception. The core idea is that when we hear speech, We aren't just processing sound waves, we're also sort of subconsciously activating the brain areas linked to producing those sounds ourselves.
Okay.
The theory basically sees speech as this super efficient code based on the physical movements, the gestures of our mouth, tongue, vocal cords.
And this connects to mirror neurons, doesn't it? I've heard about those.
Exactly. Those amazing brain cells that fire both when we do something and when we see or hear someone else do it, they really support this motor theory.
So when I listen to someone speak, my brain is kind of secretly practicing making those sounds.
That's a great way to put it. It's like your motor system gets engaged just by listening. So shadowing taps into that directly. You're training your mouth and tongue while you train your ear and brain.
Wow. Okay. And what about plain old repetition? Why does just repeating help?
That one's a bit more straightforward, but still crucial. Basically, repetition gives your brain more time on task, more exposure. It helps strengthen those neural pathways. The goal is to move from conscious effort, like thinking hard about what a word means, to automatic knowledge, where it just comes naturally.
What you need for fluency, right? You can't be stopping to translate every word in your head.
Exactly. Automaticity is key for real comprehension and smooth communication.
Okay, this is great. Connecting the dots between how our ears work, the brain's building blocks, mirror neurons, and building automaticity. It really paints a picture of why these techniques are effective. So let's shift to practice. How do people actually use these, especially for something like learning a language?
Right. In language learning, shadowing is super common. The main goals are usually better pronunciation, getting the intonation right, the stress patterns, and just overall fluency sounding more natural. Learners typically listen to audio that's at their level. Could be short phrases, dialogues, maybe even bits of stories from graded readers, and they just echo it.
Are there different flavors of shadowing? Does it always have to be perfectly simultaneous?
No, there are variations mentioned in the sources. There's what they call full shadowing, trying to speak right along with the speaker, zero pause. Then there's slash shadowing, where you leave a tiny gap, repeating right after the speaker finishes a phrase or chunk.
Okay.
And you can also do it with or without the text. Direct shadowing is audio only, relying just on your ear. Indirect shadowing means you read along with the transcript while you listen and repeat.
That indirect method sounds like a good way to start. A bit of a safety net with the text there.
Yeah, it can be less intimidating. And often, the way people integrate it follows steps, maybe similar to using those graded readers you mentioned.
How so?
Well, you might first just read and listen to the material a few times to get familiar, then maybe listen without reading, and then you add the shadowing. Maybe start with indirect shadowing with the text, and then challenge yourself later to do direct shadowing without the text.
Layering it up. Build familiarity, then add the active speaking part. That makes a lot of sense.
It does.
What about simple repetition? How does that look in a learning context?
Often very direct. Classic classroom stuff. The teacher points to a picture, says the word, students repeat. Or drilling vocabulary lists, say the word, repeat it 5 times. It's really foundational for just basic recall and getting vocabulary into your head.
Gotcha. And thinking about being efficient, you mentioned graded readers again. One source had tips about reading them quickly. How does that tie in?
Yeah, those tips are really relevant to this whole idea of processing information efficiently. The advice was basically, when you first read something, don't get bogged down.
Don't stop for every single word you don't know.
Exactly. Unless it completely blocks your understanding of the main point, just keep going. Focus on speed and getting the gist first. Then, and this is key, go back, reread it later for deeper understanding. Look up those specific words you skipped.
So it connects back to repetition and layering. First pass for speed and overview, later passes for depth.
Precisely. It's about interacting with the material multiple times, but maybe with a different goal each time. That allows for both efficiency and thoroughness.
That's a fantastic practical tip. Don't aim for perfection on pass 1. Get the big picture, then repeat for detail. Okay, theory, practice. Now for the proof. What does the actual research show? How effective are these techniques? Is there hard data?
Yes, there is. We looked at a really interesting study conducted with English learners, specifically at PIA Mangansidi Makassar. Their main goal was to see if using shadowing could concretely improve speaking performance, things like accuracy, fluency, and how understandable they were, and also affect their motivation.
Okay, the big questions. Did it work?
It really did. The results were statistically significant. The study found shadowing did lead to major improvements across the board: accuracy, fluency, comprehensibility. And they had numbers to back it up. The group that used shadowing the experimental group, their average gain score in speaking performance was 21.1 points.
Okay. And the control group, the ones who didn't use shadowing.
Their gain score was only 6.11.
Wow. So more than 3 times the improvement for the shadowing group?
Yeah.
That's substantial.
It really is a very clear impact on actual speaking skills.
What about motivation? Did the students like doing it? Did it help them feel more engaged?
That was another really positive finding. Shadowing significantly boosted motivation. On a standardized scale they used, the shadowing group scored an average of 84.70, which the study categorized as high motivation.
That's great. Did the students say why they found it motivating?
Yes, and the feedback was insightful. They mentioned things like, it helped them learn pronunciation correctly by copying a model. It expanded their vocabulary because they heard words used naturally in context. They also said it built their confidence actually producing the language felt good. It increased their exposure to English, and importantly, many felt it helped them sound, closer to native speakers.
So it's not just effective. It actually makes learners feel better and more positive about their learning journey. That combination is powerful.
Definitely.
And we also had a study focusing just on repetition, right? A different context.
Yes, that was the STTR Sapuz study. It looked at using simple repetition techniques to boost English vocabulary, specifically with mechanical engineering students.
And the verdict there. Did straightforward repetition help?
It did. The study concluded that repetition improved the students' vocabulary knowledge and also their ability to actually use those words to make sentences. Observers also noted it seemed to help students absorb and understand the material better and even participate more actively in class.
So even the basics work. A good reminder not to discount simple repetition for building those foundational blocks like vocabulary.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the techniques work. They can boost motivation. But learning, especially language learning, is never totally smooth sailing, right? What kind of problems did learners still run into?
Yeah, the studies were realistic about that. Even with these techniques, learners faced common challenges. Things like mispronunciation of certain sounds, grammatical errors were still frequent issues with verb tenses, prepositions, articles, that kind of thing. And also lexical errors.
Meaning word choice.
Yeah.
Using the wrong word.
Exactly. Using a word that wasn't quite right for the context or maybe just awkward phrasing. And then fluency issues too. Unnatural pauses, sometimes switching back to their native language, halting speech, or repeating words unnecessarily while they were thinking.
Can you give us a concrete example, something specific they observed?
Sure. One source gave examples like mispronouncing the word child, saying something like child instead of the proper child sound, or common grammatical slips like saying when I were child instead of the correct when I was a child.
Ah, yes. The classic I were mistake. Many learners can relate to that one.
Right. And the source also mentioned what it called shy cat errors, which seems to be their term for just awkward or inappropriate word choices, even if they didn't detail the specific example there.
Shy cat errors.
Okay. Yeah.
So, given these persistent problems, how do techniques like shadowing actually help address these specific types of errors?
Well, shadowing is particularly good here. For pronunciation, the direct mimicry helps train your mouth and tongue physically to make the correct sounds. That's pretty direct. But maybe more importantly, by constantly listening to and repeating correct models, you're getting massive exposure to proper grammatical patterns and natural word choices used in context.
So you start to internalize the right way of saying things, almost unconsciously.
Exactly. It helps those correct patterns sink in, making you more likely to produce them yourself without having to consciously think about grammar rules all the time. Repetition then helps solidify those patterns through practice.
Makes sense. Now, there was also a really important point about how teachers or partners should handle mistakes when they happen, right? Something about correction.
Yes, a very key pedagogical point. The strong recommendation from the sources was to use indirect correction rather than direct criticism.
Okay, what's the difference? Direct is just saying that's wrong.
Pretty much. Direct criticism might be, you pronounced that word wrong, or that grammar is incorrect. It can be quite blunt and discouraging.
And indirect.
Indirect correction is much gentler. Instead of pointing out the error, the teacher or partner simply remodels the correct form. So if the student says, when I were a child, the teacher might just casually respond, oh, really? When you were a child, what did you like to do? Just naturally weaving the correct form back into the conversation.
So you provide the correct model without making a big deal about the mistake.
Exactly. The idea is that this maintains the student's confidence, it lowers their anxiety about making mistakes, what linguists call the affective filter, and crucially, it encourages them to keep talking and practicing.
Which is essential for actually improving. You need to feel safe enough to try, even if you mess up.
Precisely. Fear of errors can really shut down learning.
Okay, that's a vital point for anyone teaching or learning with others. Be gentle with corrections. So we've covered language learning pretty thoroughly, but you mentioned these techniques pop up elsewhere in surprising ways.
Yes, this is one of the really fun parts, seeing these fundamental ideas applied in totally different domains. Like speech shadowing has been used in some fascinating research on, of all things, mobile phone use while driving.
Driving. Wait, how? Are they shadowing the radio?
Not quite. Researchers actually had participants perform speech shadowing tasks, repeating sentences or word lists they heard through headphones while they were in a driving simulator, or sometimes even in controlled on-road settings.
Okay. Why? What were they trying to measure?
They were using shadowing as a way to simulate the cognitive load of being involved in a conversation. The act of listening and immediately repeating requires attention and mental resources. And the findings were pretty stark. Combining the audio task, shadowing, with the visual task, driving, significantly impaired people's spatial and temporal judgment.
Meaning they got worse at judging speed, distance, reaction times.
Exactly. They reacted more slowly to events, judged gaps less accurately, and this happened even if the drivers themselves felt like they were still paying adequate attention and weren't particularly distracted.
Wow. So the shadowing task itself wasn't the point. It was a tool to show the impact of that cognitive load from conversation, proving that hands-free doesn't mean brain-free.
That's a perfect way to put it. The shadowing helped isolate the cognitive distraction. They even varied the complexity, sometimes shadowing simple lists, sometimes shadowing sentences requiring more understanding, to show that the deeper the processing involved in the conversation, the greater the impairment.
That's incredible.
And another interesting finding, where the phone's audio came from mattered. Audio from a phone placed centrally, near the front, led to slightly better reaction times than audio from a phone placed off to the side.
Suggesting even where our peripheral attention is drawn makes a difference.
Seems so. It's just a really clever use of shadowing to reveal hidden cognitive limits with huge, real-world safety implications.
Absolutely fascinating and a bit scary. Any other unexpected applications?
Yep, in the world of singing, there's something called vocal shadowing.
Okay, shadowing pitch instead of words.
Essentially, yes. Singers focus on manipulating their vocal tract, all the muscles involved, to accurately hit target frequencies they hear. They're shadowing tones, focusing on that precise muscular control and pitch matching.
And presumably, trained singers are much better at this.
Unsurprisingly, yes. Studies show they have a much greater ability here than non-singers, likely due to their highly developed vocal control and awareness. They even use specific vocal techniques, like employing a glottal stop during shadowing exercises to help them nail the onset of notes more cleanly.
Makes intuitive sense. Singing is all about that fine motor control of the voice. You also mentioned interpreter training briefly.
Right. It's often used as a foundational exercise for simultaneous interpreters. Just practicing the basic skill of listening and speaking at almost the same time, building that capacity before layering on the much more complex task of actually translating between languages in real time.
Got it. A building block skill. Okay, wow. What a journey. We started with simple definitions of shadowing and repetition, dove into the pretty intricate science, how our ears process frequencies, phonemes as building blocks, the motor theory, mirror neurons, building automaticity.
Then we looked at practical uses in language learning, different ways to do it, layering techniques like with graded readers.
We saw solid research showing significant improvements in speaking skills and motivation, especially from shadowing.
Acknowledge the common errors learners still face, but also how shadowing helps address them, and the crucial importance of indirect correction.
And finally, these fascinating detours into cognitive science using shadowing to understand driving distractions, and even into the art of singing and interpreter training.
Yeah, it really highlights how these fundamental ways of processing and reproducing information are, well, fundamental. Understanding them gives you real insight into learning more effectively, no matter the subject. It really emphasizes active engagement over just passively receiving information.
Absolutely. So maybe here's a final thought to leave you, the listener, with, something to kind of mull over. Thinking about this link between listening, mimicking, and engaging our motor system. How else might actively trying to shadow or mimic experts enhance your learning or skill acquisition, not just with language, but in other areas.
Yeah, where else in your work or hobbies could you apply this idea of close observation and active imitation, maybe even physical imitation? Pay attention this week. You might be surprised where you find you're already using elements of shadowing or repetition without even putting a name to it.